Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode we speak to Louisa Joyner, who is the editorial director at Faber and Faber.
So Kassia and I met with Louisa at her offices in Bloomsbury, very storied history there, and we discussed all sorts of things from her own entry into publishing via academia to where Faber sits in the market, and also how people from an academic background can have very different views on literary merit than those who come through a more traditional publishing route.
It was a great interview and we hope you enjoy it.
Louisa, can you tell us initially a bit about your background and your entry into publishing?
Absolutely. My background, I originally started in academia.
Okay.
I did my undergraduate degree and then went straight into a master's and straight onto a PhD, which brought me to London, where I worked with Louisa Joyner, who at that point was about to become a Man Booker judge, because she made no sense whatever as a supervisor. She was a Renaissancist, and I was writing about novels published after 1990, so I didn't understand at all. I didn't apply to her, and she just responded because she saw the pile and was like, that'll be interesting. And it was incredible. It was because what she wanted really was someone who, as part of her supervision, was reading everything that was happening in the current literary scene as part of a background for her to begin to think, because she was determined to change things up as a judge, which she really did. She was chair the year that Life of Pi won, which is still the most successful ever Booker winner, and she really was interested in kind of that debate about what makes a literary novel.
Sure.
And so that interested me. I worked with her. I spent, years in the British Library and had, a tiny amount of money on which to live, and read all day, which is the most incredible background for any part of publishing life, editing, being an author. It's impossible to overstate the amount of the gift to your future self, really reading deeply in an area you're interested in is. And so, I read my way through an extraordinary number of novels and wrote a PhD, which is also...
And did you finish it?
I did finish it. It's like locked in a cupboard. I've got sentences that last a paragraph. No one in publishing can ever see it. It's like a horrific piece of like cultural theory which collapses under the weight of its own pretension. But it was a really good exercise in how hard it is, in fact, to write anything. So I did finish it. And then at the end of it, I knew really, I did a bit of teaching to survive, but I knew I didn't want to be in academia, and had become completely fascinated by the industry.
Was that as a result of working sort of on the Booker Prize?
It was a result of just being in a community of contemporary writers, because I think, like loads of undergraduates, I basically assumed, I didn't grow up in London, I had no contact with the literary world, and for me authors were sort of so revered, they were mainly in my head dead. I didn't think of it as a kind of live and bustling industry. I had no relationship to that. So when I came to study and was working with Lisa and with other professors in that department, so Jacqueline Rose was there, who Faber now publish, and Peggy Reynolds, who at that point was Jeanette Winterson's partner, and was, this incredibly vivacious and kind of sparkling force in terms of the crossover between the literary world and the academic world because of her work. So it just suddenly became, I had access to a world that otherwise I had no sense of, let alone how to get into it.
And in terms of that, the crossover from academia, I mean, you mentioned that what kind of flies as academic writing is very different than what doesn't. We've talked to a number of editors, but I think none of them have done a PhD route coming in. How were you regarded within publishing coming from that world?
I think it was a really interesting mixture of suspicion and, I don't want to say reverence. There was a reverence for the work, as in the endeavour, but I don't think anybody saw it as terrifically relevant necessarily to the industry.
Sure.
These are two industries that are kind of mutually suspicious of one another because their terms don't work very well together. What it meant for me in that, the academics' idea of what is a literary work, that's one book a decade going into the canon. It's not what publishing defines it. I mean, all these terms are so roundly abused.
And there's also that, the James Wood idea that, the two things that academic literary criticism is so shy of, so intentionality and any kind of qualitative judgment, which are obsessionally important to writers and to publishers as well, right? But just you're crossing that line, I suppose.
Well, so what's been really interesting for me, and has been a signature of my work ever since, is that you're either crossing the line or you just don't accept that the line is there in the same way. And then I think, and what I found really liberating was that if you start from a position that one book every 10 years is going to make it into the canon, then you just can't worry about what is canonical and what is literary. And therefore, I was really fascinated at the beginning at these micro debates about what is literary and what's commercial that subsume publishers, but that readers don't think about and the rest of the world doesn't think about. And if you kind of come from a position where you just can't worry about it, if you don't accept it as a split, that can do really interesting things to your publishing. So I think a lot of people, to this day, my publishing would be described as quite eclectic because I just don't, I'm not interested in that division. So I think, and people, I think they were right, sort of suspicious of it. They enjoyed deploying it. So the first job I had was at Atlantic, which was this little tiny independent, and the then publisher, Toby Mundy, he'd done an MA with Lisa, so she introduced me to him. That was how I got my entree, because otherwise I wouldn't have known. I could have written to people, I guess, and stuff, and I probably would have done, but she was kind enough to introduce us. And he thought it was hilarious that I was, he had a PhD on a minimum wage, like making coffee badly and answering the phone, because I started as a proper intern, and I still remember it's such a signature thing for me, that sense of being on the reception desk. Well, actually I was working as assistant, but also on reception. There were only like 5 of us, and somebody rang to speak to Toby, and they just said, I think I take a message. I went, just tell him David rang, and hung up. And I thought I was going to lose my job. I was like, I have no idea who that was. I don't know how to tell him who that was, and I hadn't fully understood that publishing then, and to a degree now, was so insular that if I said David in the right tone of voice, perhaps not at all, Toby would know who that was and what they were calling him. It just didn't make sense to me as an idea. And that I remember being really struck by how this very liberal world, this idea of sort of multiplicity that was at the same time so insular it couldn't even see its own walls, was really, really interesting. I mean, that's going back away. That's the beginning of the 2000s.
I think I find that idea really fascinating, of kind of working your way up from kind of an internship. Did you get the introduction specifically because by that stage you realised that it was an industry you wanted to work on, and therefore you'd sort of started to voice that, or was it just sort of you were looking for a job, any job?
No, I wasn't looking for a job, any job. I knew I wanted to work in publishing, because I think as well I'd done quite a lot of that point of actually teaching about the stuff I was interested in. So I taught a bestsellers course with Sarah Churchwell at UEA, and I was teaching contemporary fiction with Peggy Reynolds. So it was this fascinating, running classes with students, and you'd ask them to tell you what the colophon was on their books, and none of them would know. And these were people who were about to graduate with English literature degrees, and it's like, it's fascinating how meaningless publishing as an imprint or an idea is to people who are passionate about books. So I'd become really interested in that, and in fact I'd written a couple of books. So there was a series called Vintage Living Texts, which were academic guides to contemporary novelists. So I wrote the Toni Morrison Living Text Guide, and I wrote it like literally in my spare time to survive, because I was lucky enough to get a grant, but I think it was £8,000 a year. I mean, it was not. I was doing things to survive. So I sort of entered publishing via this. I'd begun to see bits of it from the outside via these strange angular routes. So I'd become by that point really interested. So it definitely wasn't speculative. I was still really lucky.
And were you clear, if you were doing these writing projects as well, were you clear that you wanted to be an editor, or were you thinking about continuing in the writing vein?
I didn't want to be an author. I don't think I could tell you honestly that I knew I wanted to be an editor, because I still didn't really know enough about the industry to know exactly what the other roles were. Now, I didn't know what a rights department did, or how the actual sort of crunchy mechanic worked. And the brilliant thing about being an independent is that everybody's doing a bit of everything anyway, so you're sort of getting a real sense of the business as a whole. I mean, as soon as I was there, yes, but in those first couple of weeks, I remember going to see Toby and answer to your academic the question about the relationship to academia and publishing for this first interview, chatting for about 20 minutes, and he asked me something about where my heart was in terms of novels as opposed to other works, and I gave him some really long answer, and he went, so you like non-fiction as well as fiction? I remember thinking, God, I've got to start speaking in shorter sentences. So it was a really amazing open. I didn't have necessarily a totally clear idea.
And it sounds like he was kind of open to giving you opportunities. Did you find the sort of assistant and receptionist roles sticky, or did you find it relatively easy to move up?
Do you mean sticky in terms of not being seen, or not
being seen, and finding it difficult to move up once you've proven yourself very adept at, printing and
yeah, I always find it a bit weird. I remember when I was sort of first dipping this world that you'd like go to a literary agent and the person on reception would have like a triple first, stuff like that, and you think, okay, you're like clerical class. We've talked about this to quite a lot of people. And I think this idea that the way in is doing. Yeah.
But if it is the way in, I think
exactly,
because what my question was aimed at is how easy is it? Because I think these entry level jobs are often seen as being the way in, but then at some places they are, and some places you're there, you're stuck.
I think that's quite the answer to that isn't sort of simple in that. It was the way in for me, but the company was tiny. Like there were 6 of us, so what everybody did was visible, and it was a time of rapid growth. I had an idea for a book from a friend I knew at university who at that point was presenting Formula One, and I went to see Toby and was like, she's a female presenter of Formula One, and she's got this brilliant idea for a book called The Pits: My Life in Formula One, and it's kind of about being a female in a male sports world. We commissioned it and published it. I mean, that was you can't in a big, if I'd gone and knocked on somebody on, quote, the 5th floor's office in a conglomerate and just said, I've got an idea, I think they would have not known where to look. It would have been interesting. Because it's just not the same level of natural visibility. I think as well, publishing has had to learn to get better at recognising its own expertise. I think one of the things that really informs its own inaccessibility is not being clear about where its own value lies. So I think sometimes it starts people at that level to sort of, as everybody's sort of in a kind of strange way working out where they fit. You can get stuck. I think that can happen at every level. You can get to a point where suddenly you feel that you're thwarted. Equally, none of the admin goes away. Publishing isn't an industry where you end up, unless you're at an extremely senior level, even then, less and less. So being an assistant to somebody can be a fantastic way to understanding the business, but it depends, I would say, on the size of company. Entirely.
And was your internship paid? And is that something that has obviously sort of been a big problem in a lot of these industries, is unpaid internships?
Now, I think it, if it was like at a minimum wage or less level, because I had a conversation with an amazing colleague there about the fact I was applying after being there for a couple of months for completely random jobs. I went for a rights assistant in illustrated books at Transworld because it was a job, and they were like, "Why are you doing it?" And I was like, "Because I don't know anybody in London, and I have to pay my I'm not staying at my auntie's. I'm not connected, and I need to live, and I just have to get a job." And then I was lucky enough that Then Atlantic hired me as like a editorial assistant, but it wouldn't have been enough to survive on. I could do it for 6 weeks, having run up to it and saved money, and then
And could you talk us through your progression from Atlantic to where you are now, your rise to power?
It's been really wonky. Was it
resistible?
Oh God, definitely. I was at Atlantic for 7 years, and I worked up really quickly there from assistant editor, and I was editorial director there within 5 years, so it happened fast. But the company was also growing at an incredible rate and changing, and it was going through a sort of moment where it was going to be a different place. There were huge ideas about growth. This was around 2006, 2007, as also the economics of everything was really shifting. And I got persuaded into a totally extraordinary job by somebody senior at Random House. I did this funny mixture of mainly quite literary or accessible literary fiction, but I also did some serious non-fiction. I did some big commercial non-fiction. I like selling books in big numbers, and I like having ideas, and commissioning non-fiction is a great way to explore that stuff. So I published a best-selling memoir by an ex EastEnders actress who was actually a really interesting thespian that sold 250,000 copies for Atlantic. So we ended up in at Virgin at Random House, which is so bizarre, which very quickly worked out was a very strange move. It meant to be they'd bought the company as part of an idea of growing and changing it. At the time the bottom fell out of travel, the idea was they were going to create this amazing travel letter with Virgin, and Virgin owned Thames and Hudson. Was it Thames and Hudson? There was a literary imprint, it wasn't Thames and Hudson, another literary imprint that Alan, I'm sorry, forgive me, they bought Virgin with the idea of resuscitating a literary imprint it already owned, but then it became clear that there was too much work to do just to get that business in shape. So it was completely fascinating. It was like doing an MBA. It was working on books that I understood but weren't necessarily where my passion was. And I was there for about 18 months and then had my first child, and on maternity leave I was like, yeah, this is bonkers. I've really learnt loads, but this is not the natural place for me. So I went to HarperCollins. I was covering initially a maternity leave, but with a view to staying, because at that point what they wanted to do was, before they'd launched their Borough Press imprint, and they wanted to publish at the most literary end of the spectrum for HarperCollins, as opposed to Fourth Estate, which was the more literary imprint, but with the commercial heft of what that can do when it understands that a book can really fly. And I did a couple of things there. I published Nathan Filer, which went on to win the Costa, and kind of demonstrated what can happen when you put the commercial machine behind a book that the literary establishment has embraced. And I did this series, I did a number of things, but I also did a series which was commissioning 6 contemporary novelists to rewrite the 6 Jane Austens. So that was Curtis Sittenfeld, Val McDermid, Joanna Trollope, and then they did, after I left, they did Alexander McCall Smith. That was an idea that would be played out very interestingly and differently depending on the imprint in which you'd done it. But it was a really interesting exercise for them. The Curtis Sittenfeld is brilliant, and actually so is Val McDermid. Joanna Trollope was the first and hardest in lots of ways, I would say, but none of them worked on its own terms. But the terms were disputed, as you would expect. Anyway, so that was HarperCollins. And then I got approached by Canongate, and I really missed being independent. And I was on maternity leave with my second child. And yeah, they taught me into it. And I went there, had a great time, published some really interesting books, including Ayobami Adebayo, which was the Bailey's shortlisted novel. Lots of interesting things there. Just wonderful to be back at independent. I realise it's where my soul is.
Can you talk to us a little about the difference between independents and sort of the more commercial imprints? You know, both in terms of the industry, but also what it's like working for them, and why you preferred one to the other.
I I always feel nervous about this question because I recognise the value in both, and they make fabulous homes for different kinds of editors. I think I'd grown up in an independent, and I'd liked my publishing there, and I liked working across all departments really, really closely, and the flexibility. So I think it's easier to publish eclectically in a smaller independent house. Not having imprints makes a big difference in terms of how your publishing is seen, and so that definitely suits my style. But I came away with such respect for both the commercial divisions that I saw operate, and I think actually it made me recognise that the secret to publishing brilliantly is just really respecting the genre in which you work, whatever that is. It sounds like stating the obvious, but I think sometimes independent publishers can think their way into things, and so you can be great to be experimental, but if you don't have that real reverence and respect, you sometimes miss what might look like a micro difference, but to the reader is a really, really important change.
And can we talk a bit about the mechanics of editing? You know,
Yes.
I thought that I saw Joanne Harris on Twitter this week. She does these sort of series of 10 tweets, and there's one about editors, which I thought was really interesting. But you know, just as process, maybe using an example, you could talk through, you know, for someone who hasn't been edited at book length, what's the process like? How does it work? How does it vary between individuals and things like that?
It varies quite considerably. I'm a really hands-on editor, and I'm really happy to work a great deal with somebody. I can give you two examples useful.
Sure.
Okay, one fiction, one non. So with Ayobami, that's kind of a good example. I recognised that was a fabulous voice and a fantastic story, but that the opening and the ending were cooperating with what it was trying to do.
How did the manuscript come to you?
It came to me via an agent. Almost all of what I publish, particularly in fiction, is via an agent. If it's non-fiction and it's an idea, I might go and seek somebody out, so they might not be agented, but tends to be with fiction. I mean, this is something you should be.
Do you take unsolicited manuscripts?
No, we don't. We've talked about, I think, ways around thinking about that, but I don't know, I try sort of between 400 and 600 novels a year, and it's all you can do to keep on top of that. I physically don't know how we'd process it if we started. That isn't to say that there aren't really interesting questions about how you diversify what you read and where it comes from.
Sure.
And that's a definite question. In terms of the editing, what I would do is you get the book from the agent, if there's something in it you think you want to work with, you approach them, assuming, let's say, that it's not part of a sort of hotly contested auction, which some things are, but most things aren't, and it doesn't mean anything about the quality of the book. But assuming it's a book that's being created in the UK, so I'm not buying it from America from an editor who's already edited it, I then give the agent an idea of what I think the level of work that's involved is. And with a non-fiction example I was going to give you, this is a really beautiful memoir that we published a couple of months ago called Letter to Louis. That is an extraordinary story, and it is one woman writing to her son who is significantly but not severely disabled. Her story was extraordinary, her writing was exquisite, but the book itself had a strand that wasn't working. So I phoned the agent and said, I absolutely love it, but we would want to change the title. It needs a different chapter structure. I'd probably be cutting about 30 to 40,000 words.
And this was off manuscript, not off proposal?
Manuscript.
Right, okay.
And this is why I think we need to do this, and this is where I think you'll end up, and this is why I think it's a good idea. You should go away and have a think about that, and if that's something that you think will work for your vision for the book, then we should pursue it. And both author and agent actually were really pro, and they understood what the reasoning was, and we did that work. And we published the book, and it's got 46 5-star reviews on Amazon. There are no other reviews, they're all 5-star reviews. And amazing critical reception. It's been a complete joy. It's a really difficult subject. Lots of people don't want to read about disability, so I don't necessarily know that it will pop, but the book itself stands on its own merits, and it was just about seeing what was already... It's a kind of... I think of it editorial as being absolutely like midwifery. You know, it's a process of helping someone deliver a nascent baby.
And what does that look like sort of on a kind of relationship level? Like, do you tend to put things through the agent, or are you sort of having a dialogue directly with the author?
No,
does it depend?
It's a really, especially if you're doing that level of work, it's a really hands-on relationship with the author. That's not a phrase I should use. It's not hands-on at all. I never touch them. No, it's a really integral. So I'm old-fashioned. I work in pencil on the manuscript, and I would write a letter. I've just done an edit recently. It's probably about 8 or 9 pages, taking them through thematically what I think we need to think about changing and why, whether that's developing a character or changing an opening or cutting out a narrative tick. And then they'd get numbered notes where anything a bit more detailed corresponds to a number on a document. That can be anything from like 10 to 50, and then a markup, and they would get those 3 things as the first edit. So I'm really like hands-on, and one of the amazing things about Faber is it gives us the time, it allows editors the time to have that relationship. And I think I'd be really interested, but I'd imagine when you talk to other editors, they don't always necessarily feel like they have the time and space in order to do that work. That's certainly something that comes up.
And if this kind of major surgery, would that only be happening after you've committed to publish the book, or could you be asking, is there situations where you could be asking for someone to do a lot of work without the certain commitment that you're going to take it on?
I wouldn't ask someone to do that level of work without the certain commitment of taking it on, because none of you know what the outcome is necessarily going to be. So what you're really asking them to do is to buy into your vision for the book. If you're doing that, you kind of need to be publishing it as well, because otherwise I could take somebody down a really long road that some other editor feels is the wrong route, and they've spent ages and ages doing that work for someone else to say this isn't what I would have done. So I'm kind of nervous about giving extensive feedback to somebody who you're not committed to. I've in the past met people, but it doesn't tend to work simply because it feels implicitly like a commitment.
And are there sort of different ways of that writers tend to handle that? Because we've heard a few things about from publishers about very difficult authors or very easy authors. Is there, early on a sense that some people are just going to, this is their baby, to go back to the midwifery, your comment, and just to go, and just that they're going to be very precious about it and not want to, and they think it's perfect just the way it is.
So there will always be authors who want different levels of editorial involvement. I don't really subscribe to the idea that authors are actually necessarily difficult, in the sense that part of an editor's role is to set up what the relationship is going to be. There shouldn't be surprises. I think that isn't to say things can't get tricky. That isn't to say you sometimes don't find yourself in a position where you don't agree. But in terms of part of what you should be doing at the setup, for me, part of what I want to investigate as we begin to commission is do they ascribe to the vision for the book, and do they think that in general terms we're all pushing in the same direction?
Yeah.
If that's true, there will be phases when things are difficult, but I think really the idea of a difficult author really is about when a publisher and an author and agent have at some point really not understood quite a big difference about what you want to do. And something when I do writing courses, something I would always say to authors is, if you get to think about what relationship you have, actually you always do, even if it's just one publisher that approaches you, try and make sure that whatever they're suggesting actually fits with your own idea for what you think you're doing. Because I've known some really unhappy authors whose books have been gigantically successful who just don't recognise their own work in the final publication. You know, they've been published in a more commercial way than they ever wanted to be, or whatever. And then that's when the trouble really comes. If you think, gosh, well, the publisher feels they've done a fantastic job and the author's feeling thwarted because really you aren't seeing it in the same way. I had a conversation recently with an author I really had a lot of respect for, published before, agent trying to find them a new home. I read the book, it just didn't feel right, and we'd been in touch and I said I was really sorry, they're fantastic, but for whatever reason this book just didn't sit right with me. And then I heard from them months later in connection to something else, and they decided just to put it in a drawer because the only offer they'd had wanted to publish it in a way that felt really uncomfortable, and they just thought, okay, something about this isn't doing what I want it to do. It's incredibly hard to do, but for them probably in the long term that's better than just thinking any deal. And I know it's easy to say because actually it's incredibly hard to get a deal, but once it's done there's no going back.
I think my experience with editing from journalism into book writing was that if you can set it up as a collaborative relationship where you're both working to the same objective, then it's not only so much less stressful, but it's actually quite a magical and quite a wonderful thing, and and it's also a necessary thing. I think I found that you need an editor, and it needs to be born out of a dialogue. But what I found interesting moving from journalism to book writing is, I sort of they were asking about the cover, and I was like, do I have a say in that? Do I, or even the title, this whole set of stuff which even with a big magazine piece you don't have any power over at all. But at the same time, certainly if you my experience, you're writing for American magazines, it's going to go through 4 drafts, and there's going to be a real serious back and forth, and I kind of expected that with a book as well. So certainly with my magazine work, the first draft just the starting point in the conversation. Now there's no pretense it's finished at all, and I think now my editor's kind of really born into that. But you do hear stories of sort of horror stories of books that barely get edited at all, right? Is that a factor of time that people just don't have the time and space to do it?
There has to be an element of that in some places. It also depends what the list itself is trying to do. Not every list is trying to publish every book in its own right. Sometimes you're publishing to a genre, and what you're saying is we publish this kind of work, and so you're actually trying to answer different questions. So does this book fit with the other books? Does it fill a gap on this list that we're trying to fill? Is that about who the author is, or whether, I'm thinking, talking about crime, for example, is it about we want a novel with a particular setting? This does that. To what degree are they? Is that editorial team of the view that their readers are really interested in that? I mean, I think they're, and I think it's a mistake to think they aren't, actually. And I think there was a whole period where this exercise in sort of self-publishing plus, where books are published with minimum effort at a quote low cost, we've moved away from completely, because actually there's no such thing as a low investment. If you're a super reader in the UK, by definition, I think, is someone who reads 6 books a year. That's a lot of time, actually, of anyone's. And this, so it's a mistake to assume that that's not relevant. In terms of how it happens, it's a really hard question for me to answer. I think it depends what kinds of books you're drawn to and what you think you need to add. And there are authors who'd want to be left alone. I had an author, I won an auction, and it was partly because quite often what happens in auctions is you'll be asked in real time for your editorial feedback, which is horrific, not because you mind telling the author, but because you have to tell all of your peers. So you're not just telling, it's like being interviewed again for a job you've already got. You've got, your boss or the people sitting around listening to you give live feedback about a book they'd all like you to publish. So that's interesting. This particular person, I was honest about the level of work. They'd been in other meetings where the editor said it's just perfect, I wouldn't change anything. That had made that author really uncomfortable, because they were just like, I don't believe that's true. But presumably the editor just thought, I just want to get the book. I'm up against 8 other people. If I'm enthusiastic, we can tackle this later. or that it really did work. It's a really difficult one to answer. Time pressure, definitely. Space, definitely. And I think sometimes an assumption that I was definitely educated editorially to believe a book is only as strong as its weakest part. So you have to improve everything. You have to drive everything to that level. I think sometimes people get really carried away by what does work, and they think that the rest can be a bit fudged. Yeah. I think
it'll drag the bad bits along with it.
Or, you know, you hear people say, well, by the time they've got to 2/3 of the way through, they've already bought it. And you're like, well, that's true. but they haven't yet written the review, which the next person reads. And thinks, well, I think the interesting thing for me about the time and space question is actually the reader's time and space, which is they have so little of it. You have to work so hard to justify that space in someone's life that you have to be utterly rigorous about everything to get there.
And then going back to sort of to your career and working at Faber, can you tell us a little bit more about where it sits in the sort of the wider publishing market and what it does and you know what its list looks like, if indeed it has a look?
Faber is a kind of exciting and interesting and wonderful place to be. It's the preeminent independent publisher in the UK. That means that we aren't owned by a conglomerate, and we aren't part of a wider business. So it's the Elliott family and the Faber family are still very much involved in the running of the business. And it's a revered list that publishes across an incredibly wide range of publishing, both in terms of its literary content and in terms of the actual types of things. So its poetry list is really famous, starting with T.S. Eliot, but including, you know, Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath, Carol Ann Duffy, Simon Armitage, Seamus Heaney. The list is extraordinary and continues to be a very live part of the offering. The poetry list here is central to what we do. There is also the Faber plays. I mean, I think the thing about Faber, for me, is that it is one of the places where the colophon, the FF, does still mean something to readers. It's recognisable. If you consider yourself to be interested in publishing, it's probably a colophon that you'll recognise. And that's in part because probably you've been, at some level, studied poetry or plays or novelists like Ishiguro or Peter Carey or Golding or Ted Hughes' Iron Man. At some point in your educational life, we've appeared in a way that's sort of special and rare. But we also have a really exciting and active crime list, and we published across an incredibly broad range of books. Last year, one of our biggest books was this incredible book called The Secret Life of Cows, which was just utterly sincere, baffling, brilliant. You know, it was a book that Alan Bennett had talked about in his memoirs, got picked up by a sales rep in a shop who overheard it. Then our editor Laura dug it up from a farming press from 1983, and it's just a strange, weird, alchemical thing, that this little book, and it has been wonderful. And so we continue to sort of just worry about publishing the best that we can, regardless of the type of book, and not worry too much about what the outside world is doing, really. Is that good? Does that give you enough of a sense? Yeah, not really.
I suppose.
Tell me. I feel like...
No, it was a good answer. I suppose what I've got going around the back of my head is what successful book publishing looks like in terms of figures, because we've talked a little bit, we've mentioned in this interview, like commercial versus, say, for example, the book that you mentioned earlier, The Letter to Louis. You know, obviously they'll have very different goals for success. Is that something that you have to have in mind when you're buying a book, and how do you carry that through, you know, the list that you work on?
It is something you have to have in mind, and you have to understand that some books are about how they might work in a really big way. So the Secret Life of Cows, which is a kind of perfect little Christmas alternative stocking filler, as well as a brilliant guide on looking after chickens, not that everyone needs one of those, has sold over 100,000 hardbacks. So that's a significant, you know, I'm pretty sure it was on the bestseller list, work. And we were clear from the outset that it could do both of those things, that it could be this Christmas engine as well as a kind of quirky offering. That doesn't mean you know it will happen, but you can set things up well enough to believe that it will. in terms of my list, I look after writers who we expect to sell in really big numbers. So that is Barbara Kingsolver and Louise Doughty, for example. And I've just commissioned a really exciting book that we have really high hopes for called The Good Enough Mother, which we'll publish next spring, which is very much in a kind of Louise Doughty sort of grown-up, elegant, but literary thriller, a psychological thriller actually about the idea the author and the protagonist are therapists, so it's actually about the psychodrama is internal to the therapist. But it's got a potentially huge reach. Lullaby would be a really good example, which is a book that we published in January that Mitzi published, which is really interesting. It won the Prix Goncourt. It's a literary novel, but it's also a book about an unreliable narrator, nanny, incredibly popular subject matter. So that does both of those things. And what we work really hard at is to balance sort of the quality that we think we can reach a really wide audience with and the prize-winning authors that we have absolute faith in that could, if they win a prize, really take off, but might be much harder because for whatever reason they're less directly accessible to people. Perhaps it's how they're constructed or what we think about what they're trying to do that is less direct. It's very hard to describe well.
So I have a two-part question. The first is for poorly informed listeners, and indeed myself who didn't know what it was. Can you explain what a colophon is?
Sorry.
It's
the
a
branding.
little symbol,
branding.
right?
It's the branding of the publisher.
Okay.
So for us,
How do you write that?
Oh my goodness! Do you mean how do you spell it?
Yeah.
There's a spelling bee. COLOPHON.
Okay.
Colophon.
Okay.
Pretty sure that's right.
Okay. Sounds convincing.
And for different, so for Chatto, it's a face, I think, in a roundel.
I think it's so true though, because I think we talked about this before, but until we got book deals, I didn't really know what imprint was. You're just outside all of that.
It's a bit like working in a magazine. You really worry about the different sections, then you realise that everyone who's reading the magazine haven't even noticed that it's divided into sections before.
I think it's something really specific to the history of publishing as well, which was that up until 10 or 15 years ago, publishers directed their content at customers, as in booksellers, so other professionals in the industry, and work quite hard actually to keep everybody else out. It used to be impossible to find an email for and especially say an editor at HarperCollins or Random House 7 or 8 years ago, and then as the industry realised it had to become consumer facing and speak directly to readers, it's had to sort of turn the supertanker around really in terms of who it's speaking to and in what way. And so colophons are as much about, I think, obviously the heritage is independent, and Faber, that's still true for us, and which is I think why it's still meaningful. But those little independents get swallowed up by conglomerates, and it's about how you offer different lists, so you can cover off the same kind of publishing in different ways. But that's not about readers because they
wouldn't see it.
They're not terribly
Sorry,
interested.
I
Not at all.
Sorry.
Sorry. So we always try and talk about money on the podcast in every context. And so, as an independent, how the kind of advances that you're able to pay for books and so forth, how do they compare to elsewhere, to other, say, commercial publishers? And I suppose the second part of the third part of the two-part question would be with the poetry, does that make any money, or is that a sort of loss leader for the rest of the firm?
It's not that simple. So poetry is commissioned on a totally different model, not least because actually with poetry it's much more about orthology and quotation rights. It's about how the words are reused as opposed to necessarily how many of the specific collection that you sell. You'll know poems and you'll see them in all kinds of places without having ever even known what the collection they were printed in was called. Sure. So that's sort of not, I can't really give you a useful benchmark for that.
Okay.
That is to say you don't, the numbers aren't huge because by definition poetry, you can't expect that you'll be able to sell a poetry collection in the way that you can sell a literary commercial, a novel that might win the Costa. How do we compare? It's really interesting. We are definitely competitive, so we can play and take part in auctions with the conglomerates at the most commercial level, and sometimes we win them. That doesn't mean we always have the most amount of money on the table, and it's all about how you ascribe value. And that comes back to the editing, the quality of what we do, the number of books on the list, the amount of people that work on each publication. So that becomes an individual decision for an author. When there is a level when things go absolutely bananas, when you're looking at things in the multiple 6 figures, up to 7 figures, which some American houses do, where that's not a sensible decision for us to make, because we can't amortise our risk with a guaranteed Simon Scarrow or a Bernard. We aren't part of a business that offsets that risk in a much broader base. So there are definitely points at which we just think that we're not interested in that model. But even in that circumstance, we sometimes, agents are amazing and they understand what we do and the difference, and we'll just say, this is the most that we can offer that author. Let us remain part of that conversation. If that's what they decide they want to do, they have all the information about whether that's of value to them or whether it's just about genuine. The gaps can get really big, and surprising things happen all the time. So sometimes authors feel like they want to go with us just because that's what they want, and I think that's really amazing, is to know that sometimes authors want to be Faber authors, but you can only know that yourself if that's a thing that actually means anything.
And presumably a lot of that is to do with the one-on-one relationship with the editor that they meet from Faber. It's
a part of that, definitely, but it is a part of the heritage. I mean, when I got offered the job a couple of years ago, and I rang my dad, who is an academic, not in publishing, he's a scientist, and he just said, "Oh, do you think you're going to be good enough?" And I was like, "Well, we'll find out."
So supportive.
But it was that weird reverence thing. He just was like, "Hang on." And I think that sense to some people, and not to everybody, rightly not to everybody, but to some people, it has genuine. It's a sort of hall of fame, or it's a sort of, it's an associative relationship, and to be on the shelves with the same publisher and with the FF. And interestingly, that colophon thing, which obviously I didn't know I was obsessed with, but I am, we put on the front of our books. Most publishers don't do that. You'll see it on everything in a way that's about us really not only just believing in the brand, but believing that it is a statement of intent. And so there are some authors for whom that's real.
This is not a question with a right or wrong answer, and I know I preface this because we asked a lot of people and their faces just drop. Obviously, you've been in the industry now for a decade, and we've spoken to a lot of people about where they think it's going, how it's changing, and how it's changed specifically over this period. And we've had some really interesting answers, both about what's happening and what's happened, but also what they think is going to happen. And we wondered if you could sort of put your crystal ball hat on and sort of talk about the industry and the changes and what where it might be headed.
Okay, sure. So really more about where we're going, not so much about where we're at.
Where you think we've come from will inform where you might think we're going. I know a lot of people have sort of thought about what happened with the huge fuss, for example, about the ebook and and also with the buying up of smaller imprints. And that has really shaped where they think that publishing is going, particularly in the UK. So
I think it's really interesting. In terms of that, I go right back to what we were chatting about earlier on, which is that publishing has got much better at understanding what it does well. And so it got completely distracted by the idea of itself as a manufacturer. But the format in which we produce our books is not the most interesting thing that publishers do. It's not whether it's electronic or physical. And that was also part of that fashion for seeing if you could make a lot of books inexpensively. It's like there are no economies of scale, and just thinking that we can make things isn't what we do really well. I think publishers, there's a brilliant bookseller called Sheila O'Reilly who used to say, when somebody came into her book and asked if they could self-publish, one of the reasons that she would say she wouldn't stock the book is she's like, every title here has about 40 people's investment in it. They've bothered to think about how it's the best it can be, why it deserves publishing over other things, what the description on the back is. There's a collective endeavour above and beyond the author that has value. And really, editorially, it's about the fact that I read hundreds of books a year so that people don't have to, so they can just... And so I think that sense of curate, the very fashionable word curation, that sense of why do something over something else, is perhaps now more of a focus than it was at the time at which format was obsessing people. But that was also brilliantly sort of Y2K, like this self-immolating end of the world sort of, we're all doomed, except we're not, because no technology has ever eviscerated the technology before it. Cinema wasn't worked out by TV, etc. So I think that was just a bit of panic. Where we are and where we're going, in terms of imprints and little publishers getting swallowed up, for me that feels like a slight red herring, because the there's a fairy story about either a massive auction or a tiny house picking up a little book that then gets discovered. The honest truth is it's really hard to make most books work, and most authors don't get killer advances that change their lives. They work incredibly hard for a relatively modest, low thousands, sometimes 1,000 print run, particularly with fiction. You know, it can be with the first outing, the hardback, and trade paperback, and everyone's working really, really hard to make it happen. So for me, that range is really important. The bigger question that it leads to really is about what diversity really means and what multiplicity of voices, and in that, publishing, like I think most of the media, has to be really honest about what liberalism really is, because it's not just an intention, and I think that's something that happens a lot in relation to publishing and diversity, is that we think interestingly about writers from all over the world, but we don't think in relation to class. We're not very good at understanding what other countries' own internal struggles are with ideas about prevailing culture, and in our own more commercial fiction, really understanding what diversity represents in terms of where an author's coming from, not just in terms of ethnicity, but also class and position.
Can you tell us about some of the particular authors you've worked with? The ones that we pulled up were Jay-Z.
Yeah, I really want to know about that.
and Barbara Kingsolver and Margaret Drabble. So what golden thread connects those three people? No. Perhaps Jay-Z, first of all.
What was...
Just tell us everything about Jay-Z.
Everything. I can't tell you a lot because it's a long time ago now and things changed. But it was amazing. So it was when I was at Random House.
Okay.
And the American sister company had bought his book, and we had the opportunity at Virgin to publish it. And I think other people at that point weren't so keen, precisely because of some default assumptions about ideas about people and what they do. So other publishers had got into really hot water trying to publish significant music artists and them not understanding the industry. But
who not understanding who? The musicians?
The publishers both.
Okay.
And then just thinking, you spend lots of money to buy a name, and then how do you make a book if they don't understand what you need? People had their fingers burnt. But the one thing that you need to know about Jay-Z, and the thing that made all the difference to me it was an astonishing book and he was amazing, was that when he got paid for his third album by the music company, do you know what he did with that money? He bought the rights to albums 1 and 2, because he was his own he always thought like a producer. So he was one of those musicians who was able to think about his own output as sort of cultural products. So the book is an extraordinary, self-aware, incredibly literary curated piece of publishing. I lived vicariously through the American editor who would go and sit on a sofa with Jay-Z and Beyonce under a little knitted rug in downtown New York and look at amazing artwork and pick it. But they had misunderstood. I think a lot of people misunderstood what working with him on a book would be like, and the results were...
Did he write it himself?
He wrote it with, because it's very heavily based on the lyrics. It's not a traditional memoir. It's really him. Weirdly, him and the Stephen Sondheim book are quite similar. They use lyrics as a way into understanding where they are at that point in the world and what they're doing. It's an incredibly sophisticated bit of publishing. Really, really beautiful book. And I still remember the conversation when we had, because still about difficult authors, where his manager phoned and said, it's going brilliantly, he doesn't want his name on the front. And it was like... So then I think we said what we'd do was a belly band so that it wouldn't interfere with the artwork that you could take off if you wanted to once you bought it, but that for booksellers they didn't have this amazing... I remember once there was a huge drama about, I think it was a Kylie book that somebody paid a fortune for, and then in the artwork she was unrecognisable because it was in one of those beautiful photographs. She looked exquisite, but you would have walked past it and just not had any idea who it was. So that was amazing, and the book was great. But it was about he had such a clear idea, and his agent, we did this amazing treasure hunt where pages were put up all over the world, and when enough people unlocked a certain page, another page would go up online. There were lots of really cool.
Have you worked with ghostwriters before for other books?
Yes.
What's that?
Although
process
he didn't
like?
he didn't necessarily have a ghostwriter. What's the process like?
Yeah. How does that relationship work? Sort of inserting a whole other person into the...
Entirely depends on the person you're dealing with and whether they are going to be honest about the fact that person exists, because some people pretend they don't, and then they start to believe they've written their own book, and that gets really tricky.
What happens then?
usually have a very awkward conversation about book 2.
Because they think they can write the second one.
They're just like, this is amazing. I mean, I know I talked to that person, but they just wrote down what I said. To a degree. So yeah, that sort of depends on the shape of the temperament of the person that you're buying the book from. And I think with that, if you're going to be doing that kind of very name-led kind of book, the thing with Jay-Z is you have to know the shape of the ego of the talent, the quote talent, or the people around them, and know that somebody understands what you're talking about. Because if nobody understands what you're talking about, then
you can't have a meaningful relationship, and you're not going to be able to.
You just all end up quite frustrated. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be the celebrity themselves. If they know that they've got a person who they trust who will listen to them, who's like, you leave us, and that very regularly is the case.
And with I suppose another kind of celebrity dealing with really famous literary authors, so Margaret Drabble or Barbara Kingsolver. What's that like?
It's a bit terrifying the first time, definitely. But actually,
do you sort of inherit them? Have they been edited by other people and then?
So no, it's so with Barbara, yes, I came and actively wanted to work with her and thought I had some interesting ideas about things we could think about in the future. And the first meeting was really scary, but it's always this. Fundamentally, if you have really understood what somebody is trying to do and you have something intelligent to say about how that is scaled up. So successfully publishing a book is understanding what it's trying to do and magnifying that noise, making people in-house. So the clearer your vision and the more people share it, the easier it is to publish something in a big way. If everybody thinks something's a slightly different thing, it's much harder. So as an editor with something like that, it's reading the book and then being able to communicate in-house to everybody what it's trying to do, where it sits, who you think it's for, and then consistently doing that in terms of how you write the copy, what the cover's like. And that she understands and buys into you understanding what she's done. Yeah. But that also growing it. Margaret Drabble was a much, much more interesting question because at the point at which I started working with her, she wasn't, it wasn't her heyday, but it should have been. She should never, it felt to me like totally unconscious sexism that somebody who is in the company really of the McEwens and Amyses of this world isn't published with that instant assertion of her stature. One of the things you can notice with the female contemporaries of some of those authors is that publishing of some of those, and this is not now, but this was true even sort of 7 or 8 years ago, that if you looked at the history of their publishing, and this is true of Mavis Cheek, Muriel Spark, Margaret Drabble, it would tell you more about the history of publishing and fashions in covers than it would about their books, because there was something about how they were unconsciously perceived that didn't see them first. It wasn't the new Drabble, it was the peppered moth or whatever, and how that fitted. So the thing that really excited me about Margaret Drabble, who I tried to buy her at HarperCollins, I was the underbidder, and then when I went to Canongate, I inherited her, but we'd already had a relationship because I tried to buy the book, was just about, it was the best problem to solve. She's an exquisite writer with a real fan base who the literary was interested in, and publishing's just slightly overlooked, and that's been entirely borne out. So she's also she hadn't written for a long time. There'd been a big gap, and she said she wouldn't write again. So there are good reasons for that. But equally with her, I've got to know her really well, and I was really excited about working with her. And I think in my first email, I did call her Maggie, and then I think she replied when she signed off, "Regards, Margaret." And I was like, "Yeah, no, I haven't qualified for Maggie yet. I have now. I've got my Maggie badge." But I felt really stupid for having assumed that intimacy.
A couple of final questions we should wrap up just of time. With everyone we've talked to in the sort of fiction world, this sort of division between planning and plunging has come up. So people who plan their novels. You're obsessed with this question. I'm really obsessed by this question.
I have never. I like it.
So the idea is you're either a planner who covers your wall with a sort of schematic,
and that is Simon.
Okay.
No, I don't think I am.
He's got a blackboard in his office. He's definitely a planner.
So. Just slightly humiliated. Or you're a plunger.
Nothing wrong with rigour.
Or you're a plunger, in which case you dive in and sort of follow your subconscious. And the second part of this is writing courses. That whole thing. Where do you stand on them? I suppose. So if you do the first thing, plan or plunge. It's a one-word answer. That's all you have to say.
I don't. Do I plan or plunge, or what do I like in my authors? What do you advocate? I'm going to be irritating. I'm going to go a third way. I advocate mulching. I think
Ooh,
allowing
mulching.
things. Yeah, I'm a big fan of mulching. Like,
What's that?
Sort of like, you know,
Like
intellectual
ruminating.
compost. Like, let something just things develop well if you give them a bit of time to be ignored, and they just fester, and you just. I think not in both ways. Whether it's being really conscious of what you're doing or sort of immediately trying to invoke something, you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself. And actually, sometimes the thing you think when you're not trying to have an idea is actually your unconscious really helping you out.
Well, maybe most plungers are like secret, unknown mulchers.
I think planners mulch too, though. I think that's, you know, but I think time is a friend. Whether you then sit down and write really quickly. Give yourself a chance to let something just brew, mulch, fester. That's not such a good word.
Fester is
Festers.
Negative emotions are not to be underestimated when it comes to writing. Getting something out of your head because you can't live with it anymore is a legitimate reason for writing a book. Like, you get to a point where you're compelled. It has to stop, and that's you know. To go back to the midwifery analogy, in the second stage, there's supposed to be a recognised point at the end of the first stage of labour where you're like, I just can't do this anymore. And your body's ready for the next bit. I sort of think there's also a point when you're working where you think, I can't think about this book anymore, or I can't have another conversation about that sentence. That's just critical mass. That's a natural.
Yeah, you're over it. You've got to.
And you need that to let go of it. Otherwise, every time someone writes a review, you want to write to them and explain to them how they didn't understand the thing that you would that letting go.
And the final thing, because we've got only like a minute or so
yes.
left, is writing courses. For or against?
I don't see how you. I would be for. I don't see how anybody wanting to spend time thinking about what they're doing is a bad thing. I think sometimes they can promise more than they can deliver.
Sure.
Definitely, but yeah.
We hope you enjoyed that. Simon, what's the big news for you this week?
Well, the big news for both of us is the progress of our crowdfunding campaign, which is now approaching 70% completion to our first goal.
And what happens at our first goal?
We get to pay our producers. Very exciting. So if you do feel like supporting us, go to patreon.com/alwaystakeNotes, and if you contribute, you receive very exciting rewards. Otherwise, I've been working on my book like a proverbial galley slave, and also have my piece on the Belgian football team published, which was exciting. Kassia, what about you?
I have been mostly looking at cover designs for The Golden Thread, which will be published in October in the UK, and also looking at the paperback designs for The Secret Lives of Colour, which is coming out in September. And then tomorrow I'm being whisked off to Paris to do an interview, and I will be taking the first train out at 5:40 in the morning and then coming straight back after the interview at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm really looking forward to visiting Paris for 4 hours.
The glamour. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted as ever by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Kassia Sinclair.
Our producers are Olivia Crellin, Ed Kiernan, and Liz Davies.
Zara Hankier looks after social media, James Edgar looks after our graphic design, and Jess Danheiser very kindly produced our music.
We're on all manner of social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, and our Patreon page for crowdfunding is patreon.com/alwaystakeNotes.
And as ever, do please visit our iTunes page in order to give us a review. It really helps other people to find Always Take Notes, which of course is great help.
Thank you.
Thank you.